Hi everyone, welcome to Data Engineering Made Easy. Today we're going to write the same user login program that we did in our Python video in one of my previous videos. Java is an object-oriented language. The main difference between Python and Java is a compiled language, while Python is an interpreted language. What does that mean? So Python, an easy way to think about it is Python will error out at runtime. So you can run your code, and when it hits an error, it'll break, right? Java doesn't do that. Java will compile the program and make sure there are no errors. And if it can't do that, it just won't even run, right? So Java has a compiler that transfers everything into bytes, and then as long as everything checks out, it'll run. And Python doesn't, right? It just goes line by line and runs each line. Java is a little bit quicker. You have a little bit more control with Java, and Python is started off as a scripting language, but now has evolved into pretty much an object-oriented language, because you can use it just how you would Java. But let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to kind of follow the same setup here. So we have our main code, and this is kind of, you can think of this as the if underscore name line in Python. Anytime you run Java code, it's going to come and look for public static void main. So what do we have to do first, right? So the first thing we had to do was we had to create a shell function, right? So static void startup shell, and this isn't going to take any arguments in, it's just going to be printing out our startup shell. So we're going to type in system.out.println, and let's give it let's write in our options, right? So the first one will be create user. The second one will be login, and the third one will be exit. So that's pretty much all we need to do for our startup shell. We can go ahead and call up the startup shell here, and it's compiling, it's building, you see that, and boom, we have our first little program ready to go. So now that we have a startup shell, the next method that we have to write is going to be the integer choice method, the method that actually processes the user choice. So this is going to return an integer back to us. So instead of void, we're going to type in integer, and we're going to then call this maybe get user input, right? Again, it's not going to take in any arguments or any parameters. And here we just need to get the user input to figure out what they want to do, right? So let's implement a new scanner, and as you can see, IntelliJ just throws in the import statements at the very top, and you'll actually start seeing how powerful IntelliJ is here in a second. We'll just call this scan equals to a new scanner, and instantly we see that there's a red line here, right? And so it can't resolve the simple scan because it just doesn't know where to scan from. So we'll just say system in, and that should go ahead and fix this, right? And we always want to hit return 0. Oh, sorry, not system scan, it's supposed to be a new scanner. Sorry, that makes sense. And return 0 here. So scanner, and we're naming it scan, and we're just creating a new scanner, and we're telling it where we want to scan from. So we're going to say we're going to print out a line, so we're going to say system dot out dot print line, and we're going to say actually we'll just have the user input is equal to scan dot next line. So it's going to scan the next line, and this is going to be a string. So you might be thinking, why would it be a string if it's just going to be a 1, 2, or 3? Well, the scan dot next line method is only going to accept strings. So if I put in an integer here, it would actually break. And if you hover over it, it'll say you need to have a string, right? So then you might be thinking, well, how do I, evaluate this? Well, it's pretty simple. We're going to just create an integer variable called integer user input. And we are going to use this kind of built-in integer.parse integer, and we're going to pass in user input to that. And essentially, it's just going to take this and put it into an integer. All right, well, what could happen here? What could possibly go wrong, right? Well, if I put in hello, it would have an issue doing this. So let's just put in a try catch block, right? So essentially, if I pass in an integer, or if I pass in a string, if I type in a string, it's not going to be able to do this integer.parse integer, right? So it's going to throw an exception. So let's just see that in action, actually, right? So let's say get user input. And if I say hello, boom, it broke, right? Because you can't change it to an integer. So we just have to put this in a try block, super easy. Right? And we'll try to do this. If not, we'll catch it and we'll raise an exception. And we'll just say system.out.println that was not a valid input. All right, so I'm just going to indent this because Python's my favorite language and indentations are everything in Python, right? So now we're going to try to do this. If not, we're going to say that was not a valid input. And then down here, when we do have a valid input, eventually we'll get one, right? Let's evaluate that input. So we'll say if the integer user input is equal to 1, or it's equal to 2, or it's equal to equal to 3, let's see what the issue here is. Has an empty body, that's fine. Oh, okay. So this happens because this integer user input is actually in a try catch block, so you have to do something called initialize the variable. So you can just say int integer user input is equal to 0 for now, and that'll fix your whole deal here. All right, so if it's equal to 1, 2, or 3, then we'll just say for right now system.out.println good job, else we'll we'll print out that was not a valid input. Please try again. All right. So let's go ahead and we should probably just put this whole thing in a try-catch block, so it's all in the same scope, right? So try to do all of this. If not, we'll catch it out here. We'll say system.out.println. You know that if I couldn't do any of this, then we'll just print that right there. Right, so here we got some curly bracket action going on. And we'll take this else out. All right, so that should build. So it's waiting for an input. If I say 5, it should. I should have left that else in there actually, sorry. Oops. Cool. That's with that. That'll be there. And I'm just gonna tag this in one. Awesome. So we have our try-catch block. We have everything we need to do, and let's go ahead and try it. Right. So if I hit a 6 or 7, it'll say that was not a valid input, and exit out of the program. Well, we don't want to exit out of the program, right? We want to keep prompting the user for this, right? So let's go ahead and create a Boolean value called valid input, and we'll set that initially equal to false. And let's just write a while loop here. And we want to get this scan because we want it to not just keep printing something out, but we want to see if we want to wait for some user input again if it fails, right? So while not valid input. All right. So we have all this code in there, not valid input, but it says Boolean valid input is equal to false. So this is always going to be true because we're not actually updating it anywhere inside this loop, right? It makes sense, right? Because valid input is false, and then it's just going to keep being false. So if we do like what they're saying in terms of an input, we're going to change valid input to true, right? Right up there, we're going to print good job, and we're going to return integer user input right there. Cool. So let's just clean up a lot of these white spaces, and that is our get user input function. We go ahead and build it, create a user, it'll say good job, and exit out. Let's get rid of this good job now, and let's go back up to the get user input. Well, let's store this somewhere. So int user choice is equal to get user input, and we want to have 3 paths with it, right? So if the user choice is equal to 1, then we want to do something and always get mixed up between Python and Java, but you got to include these little parentheses in there. Else if user choice is equal to 2, then you want to do something else, right? Or log in, I guess. And then finally, else if user choice is equal to 3, then you want to do something else. And finally, else something wacky happened, right? Cool. So here we want to create user. Here we want to log in. Here we want to exit. And these are just comments, and here something weird happened. All right. So for now, let's just have system.out.println. We'll just say user selected 1. And we'll copy that, throw that in here, throw that in there, throw that in there, 2 and 3, and then we'll just say, oops. This is one of my favorite things in programming, is that, oops, something went wrong. Please try again. Again later. All right. Oh, sorry, not Siri. Let's go ahead and run this. And let's create. Well, we hit 1 and it said user selected 1, right? Awesome. That's what we did. Let's run it again. Let's hit 6. It says that was not a valid input. Please try again. Let's hit 3. User selected 3. So it's working great. We have the choices working. We're printing out the startup shell perfectly, and we're getting user input. Awesome. So now we need to actually go ahead and create a user. So let's write another method called public static create user. And create user will return back an array, a string array, and we'll just call this create user. It's not going to take in any inputs. It's just going to get a valid username and password, check the password against itself, or check the password against the re-entered password. And if it works out, we're just going to push an array back to the main function. Okay, so I guess the first thing will be ask the user to ask the user to choose a username, right? So we're going to say system.out.print. I'm not going to print line. I'm just going to print because I don't want it to jump to the next line. And I'm going to say, please enter a username. Cool. And again, we need a scanner. Scanner. We'll call this scan equals, again, a new scanner. And you're going to get that red squiggly because it needs to know what you're scanning. Oops. And you're going to say system.in. So it knows that you're scanning the console. Awesome. So in system.out.println, it's going to say, please enter username. And we're going to create a string called username. And we're going to set that equal to scan dot next line. Cool. And we're going to pretty much do the same thing, but we're going to do this for please enter a password. And we're going to create a new variable called password. And then we'll just say, please re-enter the password. And we'll just say double check. We'll just say double password. No, double check. password. I was trying to get lazy there, but cool. So now we have three variables, a username, a password, and a double check password. We don't really care what their username is. We do care what their password is. So we're going to say if the password, and usually you can just do this with strings, but it's actually better practice to do equals double check password. Then the password is valid, right? So we will return an array, right? So we need to create an array. So we'll just make a string array called credentials. And that'll be a new string array of size 2. All right. So that looks good. And so if it does equal the password, does equal the double checked password, then we're going to do credentials of 0 is equal to the username, and credentials of 1 is equal to the password. Simple as that. And then we just say return credentials. So it needs a return statement here, so we'll just return credentials. And so essentially the whole point is it's never going to get to this line, but it's going to resolve, that little error that we had, the red line. But basically we're going to keep prompting for credentials and just return this credentials. So again, it's the same thing. Well, what if they don't match? Well, else we'll say print or system.printout, system.out.println, and we're going to say those passwords didn't match. Please try again. And again, we'll have another variable called the Boolean. It's not called the Boolean, it's of type Boolean. And we'll just say valid password. And that's initially going to be able to be set to false because we don't know if you put in a valid password or not. And then we want to keep prompting for the password, so that's also going to be part of our while loop, but we're just going to say while not valid password. Boom. Boom. All right, so again, we're going to have this error right here because it's always true. So we're going to update valid password here to true. Cool. Let's tab that in and let's enter here. Awesome. So that should be a working create user function. And let's go back into our main function and let's call create user as soon as they want to create a user. And we're going to need somewhere to store their strings, so we will do string array called credentials, because I am not creative enough to actually come up with a different name. We're just going to call it credentials, and boom. So we'll build it. Cool, it builds perfectly. Let's hit create user. It's going to ask us for a username. We're going to say data engineering made easy. Please enter a password. Let's try to type in the wrong password. So let's type in wrong, and then when we re-enter the password, we'll type in right. Those passwords didn't match. Please try again. And so we'll say hello. So hello and hello. And that worked. So I'm wondering why we got this. Let's go back and check our code here. Oh, Well, it's because we have this scan next line here. So this should be right over here. Cool. So if we were to run that again from scratch, it would be enter password as data engineering made easy. Enter password will be password. Another password, let's say 12334. Those passwords didn't match. Please try again. Please enter a password. I'll say data engineering made easy. And again, data engineering made easy. Cool. So now let's go ahead and try. So that's going to get returned and stored in this variable called credentials. So we now need to post that to a database, right? So we need a function called push to database. So let's create another method called public static, and this will not be returning anything. So we'll just have this be void. And let's just call this push to database, but it will be taking an argument, right? It will be taking this array that we have. So we're going to say a string array, and we'll just call this credentials. And it needs to write to a file, right? So we're going to do file writers, and we're going to call this file. And notice how it imported java.io file writer instantly. That's why I love IntelliJ, one of my favorite IDEs to work on. That's why I use PyCharm. Not sponsored by them, just like their stuff. And we're going to say new file writer. All right, so file writer, we're just going to call this a new file, and it's it should be writer, actually. That would make more sense. And it's going to be like, well, where do you want to write this to, right? So since we're creating a file, we'll just call it database.csv. Let's see what it says. Too many characters in character literal. That's because it's not Python, it is Java. Let's see what this says. So this says add exception to method signature, unhandled exception. So it's an IO exception, that's input output exceptions. Essentially, well, if we don't really need to get into it, you can just really hit add exception and it'll add, something right here that just says it can throw this specific exception. So boom, and it'll just do that for you and it'll resolve that error. Cool. So now we have a string of credentials. So let's go ahead and write that to the file writer. Let's just make a string variable called str credentials. There we go. And that's going to equal, actually, here's what we'll do. We'll create a couple different strings. So we'll do a string for a username, and we'll set that to credentials of 0. And this is just for readability's sake. You could have done this all in one line. We'll call this string of password equals to credentials of 1. And then let's do another string called string. We'll do str. We'll just type this. We'll just call this row. All right, and so this is going to contain one row of quote-unquote data that would be going into our quote-unquote database. Right now it's just a file. And that is going to equal to a username plus a comma plus the password. And then we would just say writer dot write. And we would do str. Oops. oh, there's no str. We called it row. And we'll just close the file after. And up in the main method, let's, I don't know why I wrote it in there. Let's call push to database, and it's going to take in credentials. Again, this down here, if it can handle an IO exception, it also needs to be able to do that in the main method. So you can just add that exception and it'll throw it in right there. Cool. So let's go ahead and run this program. And so I'll just hit create user. We'll say data engineering made easy, enter a password, say test password, and we'll just make it match test password, and it's exited. But if you look over here in your Explorer, you'll see there's a file called database.csv that's been created, and if we double click that, we see DEME and test password. All right, so let's pick this up in the next video. We're already at 30 minutes or 31 minutes. That was just a quick intro to Java. Let's finish this up in part 2. Make sure to like and subscribe if you like data engineering made easy. Thanks for watching.